Hello, leadership. My name is Trent Tosky, and for the simulation on the use of force in Chechnya and exploration through two-track diplomacy, I played the role as Emin Ortsa, a Chechen rebel commander and close associate to Shamil Basayev. After the completion of this simulation, analyzing the use of two-track diplomacy made me always try to put myself in other people's shoes to understand the political positions. Playing my role as Emin Ortsa, a staunch Chechen nationalist seemingly representing the original Chechen ideals harbored from Dzhokhar Dudayev, I learned the struggles of Chechen independence. Conversely, while doing the simulation and discussing with the other representatives, I learned many new viewpoints about this war. The main purpose of this simulation was to engage in two-track diplomacy over the Chechen War and, most importantly, find a resolution to the bloodshed within Chechnya. In the simulation, my colleagues role-played as different unofficial and non-governmental organizations, representing three sides of the Chechen conflict from the Russian, Chechen, and third-party humanitarian perspectives. Taking the roles of subordinates to major leaders or journalists included within two-track diplomacy created an environment of open discussion and a perspective understanding from every viewpoint in the first session of our workshop. We gave a role introduction and detailed the cause of conflict within Chechnya. Reading about the history of Chechnya from its conflicts to the modern day gave me a significant geopolitical understanding of its history. This allowed me a detailed discussion giving the history of Chechnya and the origins of its conflicts in a biased version from the perspective of a devout Chechen rebel commander. Reading my peers' discussions on the origins of conflict within Chechnya was intriguing due to almost everyone's answer being different. Of course, my discussion posts compared to other Chechen sympathizers may have sounded the same, but there was a staunch contrast to the Russian side. Notably, Mikhail Rikilov's take on the history of Chechnya differed greatly from mine. This was due to him being a biased Russian businessman who mainly saw Chechnya as an economic asset of Russia and urged to integrate it and nationalize Chechen industry under Russian control because, as many businessmen saw this at the time, this was the rationale. In our second session, we discussed how we best thought the conflict in Chechnya can best be resolved without the use of violence. Playing as Emin Ortsa, his history being fighting for Chechen independence for over a decade, and fully engaged with the most recent fundamentalist movement by being closely associated with Shamil Basayev, made me discuss how the situation of Chechnya in 2003 can best be resolved through a commander's bias. Under his bias, I took a stance that Chechnya can almost never have peace under Russian rule. At best, I described it as living under oppression, once again, as the Chechen people have already in the past. My solution to getting peace through Chechen independence was primarily going through the world's attention to our country and recognizing the human rights abuses, cultural differences, and firm stance of our population demanding secession. I propose that we spread Western ideals within our country, ousting Sharia law, ceasing terrorist activities, and begin to follow international law to be seen as a sovereign nation from the rest of the world. Reacting to my peers was very positive and harbored a productive environment. My colleagues all seemed to try to come to a moral middle ground between both sides, Chechen and Russian. Both opinions respecting one another, all seemingly to come to a conclusion of openness between countries to introduce economic reforms, reduce corruption, and plant a seed of peace in that area. Given this fictional timeline, whether my character gets his wishes of an independent Chechen state, it seemed that all of us were trying to find a middle ground for peace as soon as possible. That honestly is the most important. But if that were to happen, would this peace last? Would it be an oppressive peace? Or would we live in harmony with an independent or not-independent national state of Chechnya? What I knew expected going into this simulation. Myself, being vastly interested in Eastern European history, gave me a ground understanding of this conflict before the simulation. I saw this conflict as an unknown cog of recent history that is barely discussed in the West, but is far from anything unimportant. At first, I was interested in this seemingly David and Goliath story. How could a small, barely independent state succeed and succeed in that succession from Russia, of all places, by military means? After doing many readings about the battlefield tactics and memoirs of soldiers, such as Fangs of the Lone Wolf, Chechen Tactics in the Russian-Chechen War by Dodge Billingsley, and One Soldier's War, my favorite book, by Arkady Babchenko, completely fascinated me with the topic. I was amazed at the guerrilla tactics employed by the Chechen resistance and how they overcame the Russian army. It was like a modern version of Stalingrad, except the Chechens were using the tactics that saved the Soviets during the Battle of Stalingrad when the new Russian army that thought overwhelming armor would create a quick victory after the bombings of Grozny. And the fighting commenced. The Russians found themselves bogged down in the ruinous city as the Germans once did in Stalingrad. The Chechens would employ hunter-killer groups targeting lead and rear armored columns. If they didn't decide to disappear before the Russians could take fire, oftentimes they would make sure they were firing from elevated positions where Russian tanks couldn't get an angle of fire on them. This realization that a strong and determined guerrilla force can defeat a technologically superior enemy if they exploit all their weaknesses and destroy enemy morale. Politically speaking, I definitely had a developed understanding, but due to how complicated the conflict is, I definitely was no expert. I understood the difference of both wars, with the first being more of a nationalist separatist movement and the second being more of a fundamentalist uprising. My character, being a close associate of Shamil Busayev, allowed me to already understand what my character's bias was. I was surprised to find out that Mr. Ortsa was not interested in a theocratic Chechnya, but more of a nationalistic one away from Russian influence. With a large amount of foreknowledge gathered beforehand, it allowed me to be able to understand my character's bias and many others to easily understand and follow their political stances. Critical factors for a resolution to this conflict. The points reiterated by my colleague Garan Surayev when he stated, engaging in open and sincere dialogue between the conflicting partners is crucial. Investing in economic development of Chechnya and improving living standards for its residents can help alleviate poverty and unemployment, which are often underlying factors contributing to conflict. End quote. I cannot express how this would be an incredibly effective way to show the Chechen people that maybe the Chechens and Russians can live in peace together. The importance of Russia to promote an open hand of peace and promote economic projects within the country can be seen as a first step in the right direction. Another easy way for Russia to start to end animosity between themselves and the Chechens would also be acknowledging their war crimes. It seems that there are too many scars on the Chechen people from the bombings of Grozny killing over 80,000 civilians in under a month for the people to openly accept any sort of Russian influence, positive or not. You can't take back family members. If the Russian government acknowledges their crimes against humanity and then put in place a system to prevent this from happening in the future, then Chechen leaders may, but would hopefully accept and develop a plan to work forward with the Russians in a positive way for peace. This can come in many forms, such as Chechen leaders acknowledging their own war crimes, as said before, for the Russian side, but also for the Chechen side, due to them also not being innocent in that terms of war, the ending of banditry to stop the current kidnapping problem in Chechnya, and a new sparked openness for negotiations by the Chechens. Currently, at this time, the Chechens don't seem to want to negotiate much with the Putin administration. With all this in mind, there is a strong problem within Chechnya that also must be dealt with. The Islamic fundamentalism within Chechen groups is only hurting its cause for independence. From the views of the Russians, they have come to see the Chechens and their culture as backwards. This, however, is a more harmful stereotype, with the allowance of theocratic nature within this emerging Chechen state under the power of Ramzan Kadyrov ushers in a scene of chaos from foreign governments. Western powers have little interest in supporting governments run by Sharia law and civil rights abuses. At the same time, the action of these Wahhabis are also unwarranted on the international scale. The Dubrovka theater crisis is a good example of this. Western sympathy essentially was erased for the Chechen cause due to terroristic attacks carried out by the fundamentalist Wahhabi groups within Russia. The United States, for instance, after dealing with the 9/11 terrorist attacks, would not be eager to support a Russian proxy that engages in terrorist activities. The Chechen government needs to discourage such activities. This can be done with Russian intervention or not, but the end result needs to be the same. In order for Chechnya to gain a foothold of recognition of its sovereignty on the world stage, the terror attacks must cease. Lessons learned from this simulation. After engaging with my peers in this diplomatic simulation of non-governmental and humanitarian leaders on the conflict in Chechnya, I learned many lessons. Discussing with my peers led me to realize many new political viewpoints from all sides. Coming in from an American Western perspective, I had a pretty hard bias on the Russians coming into this project, seeing the Chechen War as imperialist aggression reminiscent of the former Soviet regime. I have an ethnic Russo and Ukrainian and even Taiwanese background, so I saw the war as an attempt of the Russians attempting to keep as much of its former Soviet socialist republics continuing Russification as which has happened to Ukraine before. However, engaging in the simulation, especially from a pure Chechen perspective, playing as Emin Ortsa, I developed a further understanding of the root cause of the conflict and the origins of Chechen resistance. Reading other Chechen perspectives and even the humanitarian opinions on the conflict seemed to coincide with the same perspective, while the Russian perspective harbored a different stance. The Chechens and humanitarians urged for an end of human rights abuses, with the majority recognizing Chechen culture and were wary of Russian influence towards them. The Russian leaders, on the other hand, seemed to share a perspective of seeing the Chechens as terrorists and and a blockade to rebuilding the Russian motherland. It was interesting to see how Russian leaders seemed to urge the Chechens to be Russified in order to have a peaceful and prosperous Chechnya. It came off as if the Russo leaders didn't see the Chechens as a formative group of people with vastly different morals, ideas, cultural ideas, and even language. They'd speak Nokshi. The Russian leaders the Russian leaders seemed to see the Chechen people as a thorn in the Russian bear, and by taking out the thorn, this thus would allow Russia free reign over the Caucasian oil fields. Another large lesson I learned from this simulation was the reasonings for the Second Chechen War. It was interesting for me to see how the Chechen population fragmented during its years of independence. Learning about this age of tumultuous banditry made me realize more from the Russian sentiment as to why they wanted to end the Chechen problem. In any type of society, a regime being funded by hostage, blackmailing, and fueling the European heroin trade is not set on course of peace and prosperity. The Second War, being more of a fundamental invasion of Dagestan by Salafist and Wahhabi sentiment rather than Chechen independence, made me realize a new perspective on the conflict. It allowed me to understand why many Chechen groups decided to fight for the Russians instead of the current Chechen regime. It seems as if the death of Zhokhar Dudayev by the Yeltsin administration disintegrated the Chechen coalition. Dudayev was seen as a charismatic leader who was able to unite the Chechens under a separatist movement. Aslan Maskhadov, Dudayev's successor, wasn't able to unite the Chechen populace like Dudayev did, and anarchy seemed to take place within Chechnya. This made me understand that the Second Chechen War was seen more as a fundamentalist uprising by Wahhabi extremists looking to liberate their Muslim brothers from Russian oppression. Engaging in this simulation made me realize many of the positions, to understand each leader's perspective, and to learn more about the reasons for the conflict itself. How I would do things differently. After the conclusion of the simulation, I learned many new viewpoints and fundamentals about the effectiveness of two-track diplomacy. Giving each team member a voice of differing narrative to the conflict within Chechnya honed my intuition on why conflicts can start and the process to resolving them. In terms of addressing how I would have conducted myself differently from the perspective of Emin Ortsa, having a more open-minded viewpoint could have led to more interesting dialogue. It seems that the majority of my peers seem to take a pro-Chechen stance. Me being a rebel Chechen commander, I vowed for a hardline stance on the sovereignty of Chechnya. Other members seem to have that sentiment, or at least at the start engaging in peace negotiations, with almost everyone having an anti-Russian bias. This, regardless of your opinion on politics on the matter, made the dialogue seem a little bit one-dimensional. If the Russian representatives engaged with a stronger pro-Russian bias, it would have opened up an opportunity for a more interesting and complicated dialogue. Given my hardline stance for the Chechen side, it wouldn't have necessarily made me change my opinion, but would only technically fuel my character's anger. I could have further engaged the discussion with two-track diplomacy if I had more characters willing to engage in argument against while myself having an open mind for discussion. If I acted in a hard pro-Chechen stance against pro-Russian stance, positive negotiations for two-track diplomacy wouldn't be attained. If I made sure to make my character act with a more moderate stance against the pro-Russian stance, steps towards peace may be put in motion. When a leader is hard-lined and stubborn, they won't be able to compromise or empathize with the opposing side. This leads them to often being isolated from mediators and humanitarian help. Showing stubbornness going into a two-track diplomacy type meeting will not lead to any progress. My character Emin Ortsa, however, seems to represent a very determined and staunch attitude towards the sovereignty of Chechnya. Being a close associate of Shimon Abbasai makes my character closely tied to the fundamentalist movement with Salafi Wahhabism. This makes my character this makes my character closely associated with those fundamentalists and maybe even himself who are willing to die at any price for the sovereignty of Chechnya. To stop this bloodshed, um, we must make sure to react with an open mind to the Russian perspective, which would be imperative to our success. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Trent Tosky, and I played Emin Ortsa for the simulation. Have a good day, Mr. Gladell. Take care.